Henrietta Lacks' Immortal Cells. The year is 1951. In the segregated wards of Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, a young, vibrant African-American mother of 5 named Henrietta Lacks is seeking help. She's been experiencing pain and a strange knot inside her, a feeling that something is deeply wrong. She's only 31, a woman who loves to dance, cook for her family, and paint her toenails a bright, joyful red. But the diagnosis she receives is terrifying: a malignant cervical cancer, an aggressive tumor unlike anything her doctor, Howard Jones, has ever seen. It's a devastating blow, but Henrietta, a woman of immense faith and strength, puts her trust in the doctors. Johns Hopkins is one of the few top-tier hospitals in the region that will even treat Black patients, and for that she is grateful. She agrees to the standard treatment of the day, radium therapy, a brutal procedure involving sewing small glass tubes filled with the radioactive element directly to her cervix. It's a painful, damaging process, but it's her only hope. What Henrietta doesn't know, what no one tells her, is that this visit will set in motion a chain of events that will reshape the world. Before starting her treatment, her surgeon takes 2 small tissue samples from her cervix, one from her healthy tissue and one from the vicious purple tumor he described as looking like gelatin. He does this without her knowledge, without her permission, and without a single moment of hesitation. In the 1950s, this was common practice. Doctors, particularly those working with poor, Black patients in so-called public wards, often felt they had the right to use their patients' tissues for research. Patients were seen less as individuals and more as sources of raw material for the grand project of science. Henrietta signed a standard consent form to be treated, but it said nothing about her cells being harvested, cultured, and used for experiments. She was simply a patient, unaware that a piece of her was about to become the single most important tool in modern medicine. Those samples were sent down the hall to the lab of Dr. George D., a brilliant and obsessive cell biologist. For decades, Guy, along with scientists across the globe, had been chasing a dream, a kind of scientific holy grail: to grow the first immortal human cell line. The problem they all faced was that normal human cells, when taken from the body and placed in a culture dish, would only divide a few dozen times before dying. This phenomenon, known as the HeLa limit, made long-term, large-scale experiments impossible. You couldn't test drugs, study viruses, or understand the basic mechanics of life if your test subjects kept dying off within a few weeks. Guy had tried countless samples from countless patients, but every single one had failed. They all withered and died in their glass prisons. Then came Henrietta cells. Guy's lab assistant, Mary Kubacek, prepared the sample as she always did, labeling the vial with the first 2 letters of the patient's first and last name, H-E-L-A, HeLa. She placed them in a nutrient-rich broth and waited. But this time, something was different. Something was miraculous. Instead of dying, Henrietta cells grew with a ferocity no one had ever witnessed. They doubled their population every 24 hours, a tidal wave of biological energy. They were robust, resilient, and seemingly unstoppable. While other cells were fragile and finicky, HeLa cells thrived. They could survive being frozen, thawed, and even shipped through the mail in unrefrigerated containers. They were, for all intents and purposes, immortal. The Holy Grail had been found. The scientific world was electrified. Guy knew immediately what he had. He began sharing HeLa cells freely with any researcher who asked for them, driven by a pure desire to advance science for the good of humanity. He wasn't trying to get rich, he was trying to cure disease, and HeLa cells were the key. They were the perfect biological canvas, a standardized, endlessly renewable human cell that could be used for any experiment imaginable. The demand exploded. Soon, HeLa cells were being mass-produced, a biological factory churning out trillions of cells a week, becoming the foundation for a new era of medical discovery. But as her cells began their immortal journey, Henrietta Lacks was on a very different path. The radium treatments failed to stop the aggressive cancer. It spread with the same relentless speed her cells showed in the lab. Tumors bloomed all over her body, covering her organs, causing unimaginable pain. Her family watched, helpless, as the vibrant woman they loved wasted away. On October 4, 1951, less than 8 months after her first visit to Johns Hopkins, Henrietta Lacks died in agony. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a family cemetery in rural Virginia. She never knew that a part of her was still alive. She never knew that her cells, taken without her consent, were about to embark on a journey that would save countless lives and change the course of history, all while her own family was left to grieve, unaware of the incredible and incredibly complex legacy she left behind. Her physical body was gone, but her biological self was just beginning its conquest of the scientific world. This was the profound, tragic, and ethically fraught beginning of the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks.
Polio cure science. While Henrietta Lacks was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, her cells were being hailed as a miracle. In the early 1950s, the world lived in the shadow of a terrifying plague, poliomyelitis, or polio. It was a parent's worst nightmare. The virus struck without warning, primarily targeting children, causing paralysis and death. Summers were seasons of fear, with public pools and movie theaters closing down to prevent its spread. The most severe cases left victims trapped inside hulking metal cylinders called iron lungs, machines that breathed for them, sometimes for the rest of their lives. The race to find a vaccine was one of the most urgent public health crises of the 20th century. A scientist named Jonas Salk was on the verge of a breakthrough, but he faced a colossal obstacle. To prove his vaccine worked, he needed to test it on human cells before moving to human trials. But where could he possibly get enough human cells to conduct the largest public health experiment in history? The answer, of course, was HeLa. In 1952, the Tuskegee Institute, in a moment of profound historical irony given its connection to another infamous medical ethics violation, was tasked with a monumental job, becoming the world's first HeLa cell factory. Scientists there developed methods to mass-produce Henrietta cells on an industrial scale. They were grown in massive vats, churning out trillions of cells that were shipped to labs all across the country. For Salk and his team, it was a game changer. They could douse millions of HeLa cells with the polio virus and then introduce the vaccine to see if it offered protection. It worked perfectly. The cells provided a safe, reliable, and endlessly renewable human test bed. Thanks to the unprecedented availability of HeLa, Salk was able to prove his vaccine was safe and effective, paving the way for the massive 1954 field trial. The polio vaccine was a triumph, a miracle of modern medicine that has since saved millions from paralysis and death. It was a victory made possible by the cells of a woman who was never asked and whose family received no credit and no compensation. But conquering polio was just the beginning of HeLa's incredible scientific career. Henrietta's cells became the undisputed workhorse of biology. Because they were cancer cells, they were the perfect model for studying cancer itself. For the first time, scientists could watch cancer grow in a dish, observe how it metastasized, and test the effects of different chemotherapy drugs without harming a patient. They used HeLa to discover that certain viruses, like the human papillomavirus or HPV, could cause cancer, a discovery that directly led to the development of the HPV vaccine, which now prevents the very type of cancer that killed Henrietta. The ironies of her story are layered, deep, and often heartbreaking. HeLa's contributions expanded into every conceivable field of medicine. In genetics, they were essential. In 1953, a lab mix-up accidentally showed that HeLa cells' chromosomes could be separated and counted easily. This led directly to the discovery that humans have 46 chromosomes, not 48 as was previously believed. This corrected a fundamental error in our understanding of human biology, and it opened the door to diagnosing chromosomal abnormalities like Down syndrome. HeLa cells were also instrumental in developing techniques for gene mapping, cloning, and in vitro fertilization. Scientists use them to understand how viruses like measles, mumps, and HIV work. They were exposed to radiation to study the effects of nuclear bombs. They were even launched into space on the first ever satellite missions to see how human cells would react to zero gravity. The commercialization of HeLa was swift and massive. Microbiological Associates, a company in Bethesda, Maryland, began selling HeLa cells for profit, creating a billion-dollar industry based on selling human biological materials. For the price of a vial, any scientist in the world could have a piece of Henrietta Lacks in their lab. By the 1960s, her cells were so widespread that they had become a problem. Their aggressive growth meant they could easily contaminate other, less robust cell cultures. A scientist named Stanley Gartler discovered that a huge percentage of all human cell lines in existence were actually HeLa cells in disguise, having taken over the original samples. This HeLa bomb forced the scientific community to develop stricter protocols for cell culture. Throughout all of this, the Nobel Prizes won, the diseases cured, the industries built, Henrietta's family remained completely in the dark. They were living in poverty in Baltimore, often struggling to afford basic health care. Her children grew up without a mother, haunted by a vague understanding that she had died of a terrible cancer. They had no idea that a piece of her was not only alive, but was one of the most famous and important entities in all of science. The world was benefiting from their mother's miraculous cells, while they knew nothing of her contribution, her sacrifice, or her immortal secret legacy.
Ethical legacy consent. For more than 20 years, the name Henrietta Lacks was a ghost in the machine of science. Her cells, known only as HeLa, were ubiquitous, but the woman they came from was a footnote at best and a complete unknown at worst. That all changed in 1973. Researchers, in an effort to combat the HeLa contamination problem that was plaguing labs worldwide, realized they needed to create a genetic map of Henrietta's cells. To do that, they needed DNA from her family to distinguish her unique genetic markers. So, one day, a researcher from Johns Hopkins called Henrietta's son David Lacks. The conversation was bewildering. Day, a man with a fourth-grade education, was suddenly being asked for blood samples from himself and his family because, as the scientist explained, his mother's cells were still alive. Imagine the shock, the confusion, the sheer impossibility of that statement. His wife was dead and buried, yet a doctor on the phone was telling him she was alive in a laboratory. The family was terrified. They imagined their mother, Henrietta, was being held captive, a tortured subject of endless experiments. The reality was, in some ways, even more disturbing. A part of her had been taken, commercialized, and scattered across the globe without their knowledge. When they finally understood, confusion turned to anger and a profound sense of violation.
They learned that their mother's cells had generated billions of dollars for pharmaceutical companies and research institutions, yet they, her children, often couldn't afford to see a doctor. Her daughter, Deborah, embarked on a lifelong, painful quest to understand the mother she barely knew and the immortal cells she left behind. The revelation of Henrietta's story sent shockwaves not just through the Lacks family, but through the entire scientific and medical community. It ripped the lid off a simmering debate and forced a public reckoning with the concepts of patient rights and, most importantly, informed consent. Informed consent is the principle that a patient must be given all the relevant information about a procedure, its risks, its benefits, and its alternatives, before they can agree to it. In 1951, the concept was barely formed. But the story of Henrietta Lacks became its most powerful and poignant case study. It raised a terrifying question: who owns your body? If a doctor removes a piece of you, does it still belong to you? This question was tested in court. In the famous case of a man named John Moore sued after discovering his doctor had patented and sold a cell line developed from his spleen without his knowledge. In a landmark 1990 decision, the California Supreme Court ruled against Moore, stating that once tissues are removed from the body, the patient no longer has ownership rights over them. This ruling essentially codified the practice that had been applied to Henrietta Lacks decades earlier. The Lacks family, therefore, had no legal claim to the vast profits generated by HeLa cells. Henrietta's story also cast a harsh light on the deep-seated racial inequities in American medicine. She was a poor black woman treated in a segregated ward during an era when medical experimentation on African Americans was tragically common, most infamously in the Tuskegee syphilis study. Her experience wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systemic pattern of devaluing black lives and bodies in the name of scientific progress. The fact that Johns Hopkins was a hospital that served the black community made the breach of trust feel even more profound. The fight for recognition and justice for Henrietta has continued for decades. The story gained widespread attention with the publication of Rebecca Sklote's best-selling book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. In 2013, the ethical debate reignited when scientists sequenced the entire HeLa genome and published it online without consulting the Lacks family, creating a massive new privacy risk for her descendants whose own genetic information was now public. This time, however, the outcome was different. The family fought back, and in a landmark agreement with the National Institutes of Health, they gained a measure of control. Now, any researcher who wants to use the HeLa genome data must apply for access through a committee that includes members of the Lacks family. It was not financial compensation, but it was something they had been denied for over 60 years, a voice. Today, Henrietta Lacks is finally receiving the recognition she deserves. The World Health Organization has honored her. Institutions have built statues and named buildings after her. Her story is now a cornerstone of bioethics education, a powerful, permanent reminder of the human cost that can hide behind scientific breakthroughs. Her cells remain one of the most vital tools in medicine, continuing to save lives every day. But her true legacy is a dual one: an immortal line of cells that propelled science into the modern age, and an immortal story that forced science to reckon with its own soul. Her cells are immortal. Thanks to her story, the principles of human dignity and informed consent are now striving to be as well.